So, my story to coming to Christ has a little bit of a different spin on it than most. Now, I didn't ever go through those really big drug-related stories, alcohol stories, where God just kind of completely changes your life and it's never the same. See, mine was more of a slow, continual change to becoming more like Him. So mine started as a child. I was raised in a Christian home. My dad is on Christian radio. My mom was a secretary in the church. So I was always around the church, always involved. So from a young age, I was always brought up with, your Bible stories, trying to act like a good Christian should act. Going through my childhood, I was always looked at as the leader. As a kid and as a student, I was looked to set the bar for the other kids, which for a while was okay, but eventually started to get a little tiresome. So I remember in high school is when it all began. I was, quote unquote, the leader of the youth group. I was the leader of the worship band that we had started. And everything was well and good on the outside. From what everybody could see, I was the perfect Christian. Everybody expected me to be the first person to volunteer to pray, the first person to volunteer to answer a question, the first person to be willing to get involved and to set the bar high. But on a personal level, I was in a completely different place. See, I knew all the right things to say. I knew the proper Christian lingo to use. I remember quite often going through the motions every Sunday, every Wednesday. I had the routine down. I had everybody fooled. Even to the point of fooling my own parents into believing that the way that I was acting was really the way that it was, when in reality there was a much deeper battle going on inside of me. So it all started transitioning into high school. I remember just having a very empty feeling as I was in school. I was friends with everybody. I was never what you would consider popular, but I was cool with everybody that was around me. It didn't matter what group you were a part of. I was everybody's friend. I didn't wear my faith or my Christianity on my sleeve. My close friends knew that I went to church, but that was pretty much the extent of it. I didn't really take any legit steps towards following Christ and towards leading others to Christ in my high school. And so Wednesdays and Sundays became my game to play, where I would act one way that was completely different from how I would act in school throughout the rest of the week. And it became more and more tiresome the more and more that I went through it. The game that I was playing became harder and harder to play, because outside I was completely a different way. I was acting completely different. So I remember, as every high schooler does, searching for that relationship. Everybody needs to have that boyfriend or girlfriend to have their status validated in high school. That was the cool thing, is if you had a relationship, you were part of the in crowd. If not, you were kind of on the outside looking in. That became my drive. I wasn't focused on Christ. I wasn't focused on my Christianity. My sole drive was trying to fill that void in my life, which I thought was a relationship. I thought that was something that I had to have to kind of validate myself in life. So I remember setting the bar pretty high for someone to date. I remember looking for that good Christian girl. that had all the things that I knew my parents would approve of. But I remember that ending pretty quickly when I realized that it's a lot harder than you think it is. And especially when you're at the point when God has so many other things that He wants to be able to do through you as a high schooler. A relationship, believe it or not, is not the most important thing. It's that much harder to fight against Him and to continually press towards filling that void that you think this relationship is going to fill. So I still remember nights lying awake with tears in my eyes because I couldn't find that relationship. I felt like I was the loser on the outside. And I would have done anything just to have my status validated by peers around me in high school. I would have done anything to find that perfect relationship. But that's not what God had for me. But I continued to fight Him on it. I continued to have my own way, my own plans in my own mind. And I thought that that was God's plans. I'd convinced myself that this is what God wants for me. So I put everything that I had into finding that relationship. And when I wasn't able to find that relationship, I had to find something else to fill that void. Now, this could have been one of those all-consuming moments where I came to Christ and lit a fire for Him and started changing the world around me, but that's not what I did. Instead, I turned to one thing that would eventually be my rock bottom point in my life. I found myself very slowly working my way into things leading towards pornography in my life. So it would start small. As silly as it sounds, it starts with a newspaper ad for bra sales. Something that's that simple is what started, but it was never enough. It was never enough to satisfy that need for a relationship that I had convinced myself was necessary. And it would get worse and worse and worse and worse until eventually it came to the point where I was completely consumed by pornography. I remember spending day after day just waiting for the moment when everybody would leave the house so I wouldn't have to be bothered, so I could do whatever I wanted without anybody, paying attention or without worrying about anybody being around. And that became my life. That became my way of coping with the fact that my plans weren't working out. See, I could have turned towards God. I could have realized that He had other things designed for me, but instead, I decided to try and fill that void myself. And it got to the point where I couldn't handle it anymore. And I remember being on a retreat with our youth group, and I remember one night just starting to kind of bawl my eyes out because I was just thinking about all of this stuff that I had made myself appear to be on the outside, but I also knew the true shape of what the inside was like. I remember waking up really early in the morning, must have been 2 or 3 in the morning, and waking up the youth pastor at the time, just with tears in my eyes. And I remember walking outside and sitting down with him and having a conversation where it was the first time that I had come clean about the struggle that I had made for myself. The cycle that I had made for myself that was all consumed with filling that void in my life. And I remember it being like a weight lifted off my shoulders, where we had a conversation and he was telling me about how he could helped me to stay accountable to the change. And I remember just that weight being lifted, thinking like, okay, finally I can get past this. I can move on to bigger and better things. And I remember coming back from that trip so excited and ready to get things changed. But I also remember falling right back into the same cycle, no less than a day after getting home. Now, it would have been easy for me to want to place the blame elsewhere, to say, well, you know, if my youth pastor would have helped me to stay more accountable, I could have overcome this a lot sooner. But see, the problem wasn't with anybody else, it was with me. See, I had convinced myself that this was God's plan for my life, and the way that I wanted things done was how it needed to be done. I didn't want to utilize the help that God had around me. I wanted to do things my own way. So I fell back into that pattern, right back to where I was. And I remember for a while, the only church that I was going to was a Sunday morning service where a friend of mine and me would walk in late so that we didn't have to talk to anybody. We would stay for half the service, and then we would get up and leave, and we would go and play basketball in a basketball league on Sunday mornings. And I remember getting to the point where I had just hit rock bottom. I was so far away from God that I couldn't even recognize who I was. See, on the outside, I was still that perfect church boy. Everybody still looked at me as the perfect example for what a Christian's supposed to be, but on the inside, I knew that there was a completely different story to tell. And I remember finally getting to my breaking point. And I will never forget being by myself, down onto my knees beside my bed, in tears, crying out to God because I couldn't do it anymore. I'd hit that rock bottom. I knew that I needed to submit myself to a different way of living. And I remember a feeling almost as if God was right there beside me. Almost like he had just placed his hand on my shoulder, just to kind of let me know that everything was going to be okay. And from that point, I began to see some change. Not only did I just reach out on the outside for help, but I actually meant it this time. I remember going back to my youth pastor and also to my best friend at the time and just revealing to them all the struggles that I had been going through. And I remember going through that same conversation with my youth pastor months and months before, but this time it was different. I didn't want to just make it seem as though I was just revealing what's going on to make myself feel like a better person, but I remember wanting to inflict change. And I'll never forget, there was a tool that I had presented to me from a website called Triple X Church. I think it's still working to this day, but they have software that you can install onto your computer. Now with that software, there's passwords that get installed onto the computer as well, that somebody else installs for you so that you can't take that off of your computer at any point. That was a scary thing for me because I knew it wasn't going to be an instantaneous change. But I decided to move forward with it, and in the program you put a few of your friends' email addresses in that program. And what it does is it tracks every single website that you go to. And I still remember having some very awkward Sunday morning conversations with my youth pastor, where that conversation started with a look across the room. And I knew what that look was for, and I knew that he knew what that look was for. And having those awkward conversations of, you shouldn't be doing this, and just feeling that guilt. But that was part of the healing process for me. And that's what God used to launch him being the owner of my life, him being number one in my life. So things were completely changing, things were getting better, but there was still this empty void inside me that just longed for a relationship, just longed for a girlfriend. And I remember graduating high school and applying for college. And my plan was to go to a college that not only both of my parents had graduated from, my dad actually works for the college, but also both sets of grandparents and multiple sets of aunts and uncles have all graduated from the same school. It's in Chicago. It's Moody Bible Institute. My plan was to go to the city, and God would completely change things for me there. You're being in the middle of a big city, Chicago, how could you go wrong? So I had all these plans set for, this is how God is going to change my life. And I'll never forget the day receiving a letter in the mail from the school. And I remember taking that letter and just anticipating and running through in my mind all the things that were going to happen due to the fact that I was going to be in Chicago at this school. And I was just envisioning opening that letter, seeing that letter of acceptance, and moving on to the next portion of my life. And I'll never forget opening that letter and seeing, "We're sorry, but," and not getting in. I was crushed. I mean, I was a shoo-in, I thought. I had so many people that had gone to this college, and I thought that this has got to be God's plan for me. This is it. See, I was banking on my plans again, but God had a different plan for me. And I remember crying out to him that night, "What more do you want from me? All these things that could change my life, and you're slamming doors in front of me. What am I supposed to do? What do you have for me here? There's nothing for me here. I've been searching for something all this time and found nothing." And I remember spending weeks just angry and bitter at God. I wanted nothing to do with anything related to God or to Christianity. Contemplating what I was going to do with my life next. And what I came to find out was all along, throughout this whole process, I had focused all of my time and my effort on my own plans. See, I had convinced myself that these were God's plans, these were surely God's plans. But in all reality, looking back, those were my plans. And what happened from there changed my life forever. Because from that point, God began to reveal his plan to me. So from that point, God got me involved in the church that I now serve at. From that point, God introduced me to my wife. I didn't know it at the time, but he used all that, what I would consider negative, all those hard times when I was ready to turn my back on God and run the other way. He had a plan all along, and I wish that I would have seen that, but eventually he revealed that to me. So I remember things just starting to fall in place. Now, I didn't get into the school that I wanted to in Chicago. However, I was accepted into their online program. So I started doing online classes. That's what led me to the church that I'm at now. Through that's where I ended up meeting my wife, who completely changed my life in every way. See, that relationship that I was looking for that entire time, God had perfectly laid out for me. If I would have just been patient and waited, I would have saved myself so much heartache, so much frustration, so much anger, because God had the perfect woman for me. See, not only did He bring me a relationship, but He brought me a relationship that I never thought that I would get to have. He brought me that girl that I would have never approached just because I felt like she would have been way out of my league. He brought me that girl that I had the opportunity to brag about because I felt like I had earned or gained something that I didn't deserve. And I still feel that way to this day. See, God had a plan all along. Now, it would be easy if God laid out that plan in front of us and said, follow my plan and everything's going to be all good. That's not exactly the way that it works, though. See, sometimes we have to make our own mistakes. Sometimes we stray from God's plan because we let ourselves take over. But all along, God is there guiding us, leading us. See, the thing is, for so long, I thought my way was the right way. So I didn't even look to God for His direction. He was there ready to guide me, but I wasn't looking for Him. So I went off on my own path. See, in the long run, though, God's plan won out. Because I got to the point where I couldn't do it anymore. I was sick and tired of trying to make things work for myself. And I knew that I needed Him. See, that's the cool thing, is when you finally have that moment where God shows you, see, this is what I had in store for you all along. If you would just trust me and follow me, and truly trust and follow me, not just say you are, I have lined up for you better than what you could ever imagine. And looking back, I think about some of the awkward things that I had to do because of the choices that I made. I still remember, I think it was the second date that I went on with Nikki, having to have the conversation of, hey, this is my past. And I remember telling her very bluntly exactly what I did. And you will never understand, unless you've been in that situation, the feeling that you would get from telling somebody that you care about more than anybody in the world that you've struggled with something like pornography. It's a very embarrassing, awkward feel. And I'll never forget the look that she gave me as I was talking to her. Not at any fault of her own, because I can only imagine hearing that on the other end, but because I placed her in that position. But God is good. God is always there leading and guiding us if we allow Him to. And those awkward times were steps to get me to where I am now. Years and years down the road, looking back, I can see why God brought me to the point that I'm at. I now have the woman of my dreams that I get to spend each and every day of my life with. He's brought us our first child, which has completely changed how I see things in my life. Things will never be the same. And I look back and see His hand leading and guiding me every step of the way. And there's no other way that I could have ever predicted this to go. My story, though it wasn't easy at times, turned out to be a win for God, because He was able to get a hold of my heart and I was able to put Him first. My name is Stephen Carter, and I am second.